Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Community from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. I'm Kelly McFarland.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing just exactly the same problem, just exactly the same conflict.
Today, we're continuing our series on multilateral diplomacy by exploring the Organization of American States. The OAS claims the title of the world's oldest regional organization, with the founding of the International Union for American Republics in 1889. After officially becoming the Organization of American States in 1948, the organization has centered its work around the four pillars of democracy, human rights, security, and development. For the loyal listeners of our show, you know one of the major themes of this season has been how multilateralism survives in a world increasingly dominated by great power competition. However, this episode diverts from that slightly, as recent events in the Americas have placed the issues of democracy and governance center stage. Peru's political crisis has turned deadly, and supporters of Brazil's previous president, Jair Bolsonaro, recently stormed the legislature and other government buildings in an attempt to stop the peaceful transition of power, scenes that clearly resemble the events of January 6, 2021 in the United States. Despite these recent crises, the Americas have come a long way in expanding democracy in the last 60 years, and a major part of that has been the OAS and their work in electoral monitoring and cooperation, which has observed more than 246 elections in 27 countries. We wanted to know how multilateral institutions can do more than manage relations between states and instead actually help their member states address subnational issues like democracy. So we spoke with the director of the Electoral Cooperation and Observation Department at the OAS, Mr. Gerardo de Icaza. Gerardo has been director of the Department of Electoral Cooperation and Observation since March 1st, 2014. In his years as director, he has led more than 80 electoral observation missions in more than 27 countries. In 2018, he served as acting secretary for strengthening democracy from February to July. Previously, at the National Electoral Institute of Mexico, INE, he served as deputy legal director for overseas voting and as coordinator of the Technical Committee of Specialists on Overseas Voting. He was a law clerk and then head of the International Affairs Unit in the Electoral Tribunal of Mexico. His most recent publication, International Law of Democracy, coordinated with Luis Almagro, is one of his numerous publications on democracy and electoral systems. Let's listen to the conversation. Gerardo, thanks for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure to be here, Kelly.
So for our first question, I think, we've done this with each of the episodes, but I think if you could provide a little bit of background for our listeners to explain what the OAS is and how, what are the different ways that states interact with the institution and what are some of the main issues it deals with, I think that'd be great.
Sure. So the Organization of American States is an organization that is conformed by 34 active states plus one inactive state, which is Cuba. So it's basically all of the states in the Western Hemisphere. It's a multilateral organization, and it has four pillars. The four pillars are multidimensional security, human rights, a strengthening of democracy, and development. The member states they coordinate through a permanent council, but also through ministerial meetings and through a general assembly. And they talk about both issues that are very current, but also things that we haven't been able to really solve in the region, and there are permanent challenges in the Western Hemisphere. Through resolutions, through discussions in the Permanent Council, and instructions to the General Secretariat to implement different types of projects on these four pillars. That is basically what we do, and we're also the basis for the inter-American basic legal system. So anything that is decided in human rights comes out from the Inter-American Human Rights Commission or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where individuals that their human rights have been at some point been violated can present a case there. On my end, we observe elections throughout the region through the 30 4 member states were able to. We need to be invited. About 28 states have invited us to observe their elections, and we present reports on what we find while observing those elections.
So you just mentioned a little bit about what your office does, and you direct the Electoral Cooperation and Observation Department. Can you give our listeners a little bit more background into that? And also, what are some of the best examples of success that you've seen in helping with the OAS, helping with democracy promotion throughout the Americas? And, what are some of the challenges that you're finding in today's atmosphere?
Sure. Well, that's a very important question, and it's a very difficult question to answer, especially the second part. But so the OAS has been observing elections in the region since 1962. Electoral observation has really evolved, as has democracy in the region. I would say that it started in 1962 with a couple of elections in Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic as really mechanisms to legitimize politically people who were being elected. As the third wave of democracy began to flourish in the region, and we got better elections, the OAS started deploying larger missions throughout the countries of the Americas, and it really began to be a force for dissuasion, but also denouncing electoral fraud in the region. As electoral processes got better because we had more independent electoral management bodies in the region, it began I would say, in the early century, between, I would say, 1998 and 2010, it really began to be more of a implementing recommendations, observing elections, and trying to make those elections better. But we began slowly to have better elections and not have that many instances of fraud and illegitimate leaders coming to power. In 2016, that all started to change with the advent of disinformation and misinformation in political processes, and that began to be a norm in the region. We now find ourselves in very complex electoral processes where everybody believes that they have their own narrative and the facts don't matter anymore. We, on our end, believe that obviously the facts are very, very important, and I think that the missions now are fundamental to give a strong report and a truthful report on what really happened in an election. And so when we start seeing what electoral observation missions signify or what they mean today, it's really a cumulative effect. So we are still a legitimizing force for politicians who are being elected. We are still a force of dissuading and denouncing fraud when we see it. Fortunately, we see it a lot less. We are clearly a tool for improvement of electoral processes in the region through recommendations and comparative observation. And now since 2016. I believe that we are a tool to report truthfully, technically, and very impartially what happened in an electoral process. Now, can I give examples? Sure. There are many examples where I think that we've done, a very good job in improving elections. But I was just talking to someone this week about the 2017 election in Honduras, which was a very controversial election where the OAS observation team said that we did not trust the results of the elections, that we could not stand by those results. And from that, obviously, it was a complicated political situation afterwards. But eventually, when things calmed down, we were invited back by the Congress. We were the only international institution that was able to talk to all of the parties that were involved in the political negotiations. And we proposed a constitutional reform that allowed for a complete re-engineering of the electoral system in Honduras. And 4 years later, they had very, very, improved elections, which led to a transition and a new power coming in, and more transparent elections. So definitely, I think that's one case, but we've also had to mediate after very controversial elections in Ecuador and in Peru in the last few years, and I think we've been able to handle those very complex situations in a good manner. What are the challenges that I'm seeing? Too many to mention in 5 to 10 minutes, but for sure, the polarization in the region and the polarization in the political discourse is a major challenge. Misinformation and how we understand the use of social media in elections, I think, is a challenge for sure, and how, while we're still trying to figure that out, we're going to face new problems like AI and a whole different kind of way of doing politics and doing elections in the coming years. Definitely a problem that we still are carrying over from, and we should have already had better solutions to, is political finance and illegal or dark money coming into elections, not only from criminal activities but from overseas, is a challenge as well. And then the responsibility of political actors in not accepting results or in attacking electoral institutions, attacking electoral systems, attacking electoral laws, sometimes even when they win. And so that is also a huge challenge. I would say I would leave it at that, because those are the main challenges, but we still have a lot of challenges in elections throughout the region.
So I want to ask you sort of a follow up to the last question, and you mentioned Peru and elections there. So in the midst of the current protests that are happening there, how do you see that playing out in the democracy electoral reform frame of what you and your team do at the OAS?
I mean, we had the secretariat that my department is involved in just had a mission that involved 7 foreign ministers of the region from, I would say, all sorts of different ideological spectrum, and they visited Peru prior to what happened in the last couple of weeks, and they spoke to all of the actors. And I think that it goes towards a broader question of multilateralism. Is most of the international organizations, if not all, were built to resolve problems between countries. So between Peru and between Colombia, or between Ecuador and between Peru, or Chile and Bolivia. But we haven't, or the international community has not built a strong system of resolving internal problems through international organizations. And so most of the solutions uh, that are proposed, sometimes they are proposed, sometimes they're not even proposed at an international level, or ad hoc solutions. And we really haven't, or the countries that are in charge of building the inter-American system, or the universal system, or whatever system, the European system, have not built the institutions that we need, the protocols that we need to resolve problems that are, internal. And if we take Peru out of the uh, of of the question for a second, and we're looking at different countries in the region, we are seeing clear institutional problems that need to have some sort of solution that perhaps goes helps constitutional mechanisms in those countries. We're seeing executives attack electoral management bodies. We're seeing judiciary and executives go at it. We're seeing clearly Congress and executives um, fight and really being in a power struggle. And these mechanisms to solve those issues, to be able to negotiate through these issues in a way that doesn't involve the destruction of the other body, or of the other branch, have not we haven't developed those internationally. And it's no fault of, let's say, of the OAS, or the UN, or the it's just the way the international system was built. It was built to resolve issues between countries. And where we're seeing most of these uh, political problems, but also social problems, are within countries. And I think that that is why we have two very good mechanisms, which is, one is for the defense and promotion of human rights, although it's sometimes it's overwhelmed by the amount of complaints that come from our countries, which is the Inter-American Human Rights System. And the other one has to do with having better elections. But as you have said, some of these things, um, their origin come from a political or an electoral context, but sometimes they don't, and they're just simply power struggle between the different branches. And I think that that's the main challenge that we have in the case of Peru. Clearly, we were in the electoral observation missions, we are very clear that we did not see uh, fraud in the elections of 2021. We did not observe uh, any sort of, 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 of let's say, uh, fraudulent elections, but and we supported, we clearly supported the electoral management bodies in you know in their work. They're independent and they're very professional in the way they do their work. But I think that in the case of Peru, what we're seeing, and not only because of these elections, but what we've seen in the last 5 to 7 years, is a problem that stems from an institutional, the way their institutions are organized. And it's certainly not the best situation to have, whatever it is, 5 presidents in the last 7 years, or 6 presidents in the last 7 years. That's clearly not um, and I would say not the fault of the president. It's the fault of how the institutions are structured, and that, in my opinion, um, they have to look at what are the benefits to having that system, and what are what the different um, aspects that could be improved so they have more political stability.
Yeah, I think your point about the structure of institutions is a key point and a very interesting one, especially in light of your comment about the structure of places like the UN, the OAS, and they were built for the interaction between states, not necessarily dealing with what's going on within states. And this actually moves us into our next question pretty well. And you mentioned the structural issues and more groups and different types of groups that now organizations like the OAS have to deal with. And what by that I mean, non-governmental organizations, civil society that are advocating for things like democracy promotion or other things. And how have you experienced these types of organizations interacting with the OAS, and how does the OAS go about fostering cooperation with them?
So we definitely there is an area of the OAS that is involved with civil society, and actually NGOs can register as NGOs that are tied to the OAS. Also, in our different general assemblies, we have a dialogue with civil society. Um, in our case, we do have contact with national observation groups, and what we're seeing, unfortunately, more and more is attacks on national or citizen observer groups, and these attacks, they vary widely from just social media attacks to intimidation to uh, physical attacks or raiding of their offices, to even things that you wouldn't necessarily interpret as attacks, but are definitely obstacles for them to do their job. Things like they don't get their accreditation until a couple of days or the day before the election, and then they have to, hand out 1,000 accreditations throughout the country in 12 hours, things like that. And we do report these things, and we do have in all of our observation missions, we have a dialogue, an extensive dialogue with national observer groups. But we're also seeing that, a lot of these civil society groups are now, being, I would say, more and more politicized, and the technical groups that are very useful and for in our case, um, observing elections, and you need them to be impartial, are fewer and fewer throughout the region, unfortunately, and the different aspects of polarization have also brought a lot of money. So if you have a different, a view on a certain issue, and you represent that view in your statements, you will get uh, more money. Whereas, what we need right now are, in the case of elections, are more technical, specialized citizen observer groups. We need fact checkers. We need, um, you know, uh, bodies that are doing, that are protecting um, human rights defenders, that are protecting journalists, that are informing journalists in a impartial and technical manner.
So I'm going to get you out of here on one last question, and we tend to ask folks to kind of get out their crystal ball and let us know what they think about the future. But are you optimistic about the future of multilateral diplomacy in the Americas?
I am. I think that the OAS brings to the table things that other organizations, and there have been created in the past. Every time there's an ideological, I would say, consensus, or what seems to be like a consensus in a lot of the countries in the region, we build new institutions and things like that, and sub-regional groups and things like that end up um, really disappearing after a while, because they represent an ideological um, agenda, and not necessarily a a one based on very objective goals. And and the OAS has sustained itself for decades and decades. And the reason it does that is it brings together, in a space of political dialogue, all of the countries in the hemisphere that want to be there and want to um, be part of the charter of the OAS and adhere to the Inter-American human rights system. And I think that's fundamental. What do I think um, needs to be more and more developed? I think that we need to find tools, and those tools exist already in international law, um, that uh, that help us as organizations um, work on the different challenges that member states have internally. And what are these um, tools that we have? They are, the tools that exist and that have existed for centuries on the peaceful resolution of disputes, that are um, political and diplomatic negotiations, that are good offices, that are mediation and conciliatory process, basically, in the evolution of the political mechanisms to solve problems. If we can find a way to use these tools and build protocols to how to implement these when there's a crisis within a country, I think we'll do a better job at resolving the issues that are right now in the political sphere of almost each country in the region. The other thing is that I think that we shouldn't have false expectations of what multilateralism can achieve. Multilateralism was not built to um, to be a very quick and painless um, process. No, it's a process where everyone has a voice. It's a process. In the case of the OAS, it's the most democratic international organization, and I can say this, in the world, because a country like St. Kitts and Nevis has the same weight, their vote, that the most powerful country in the world, that's the United States. And so when you have clearly countries that are so so different, with national interests that are so diverse, um, there are going to be issues on which they agree and issues where they don't. And the fact that um, both the voices of the smaller countries um, are respected as much as the voice of the larger um, countries are, and they have the same weight votes wise, I think, is has its benefits. But it also, we have to understand that not everything is going to be solved um, looking at multilateralism. And I think that there has to be some ownership within countries that that mistakes are made sometimes nationally, and and it's also useful to have somebody to blame. Like many times we blame, um, international finance situation institutions for our economic problems. Yeah, well, uh, but not everything is the fault of the IMF. Not everything is the fault of the World Bank, and certainly not everything is the fault of the OAS. Most of the time, the international organizations are working to, improve the situation, but in a responsible way. But we have to understand that international politics are also many, many times an extension of national politics, and if we can work all of these things out in a more, in a calmer way, and everybody kind of um, uses these mechanisms in a responsible way, then multilateralism has an amazing future.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. I like ending on optimism there. There's, as you note, there's challenges abound, but I think there is the mechanisms are there, the tools are there, and I think I have an optimistic outlook on the future as well. So, Gerardo, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It was an immense pleasure.
Thank you again to Gerardo de Icaza for his illuminating comments and thoughtful answers. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will again shift focus slightly from regional institutions to multilateral organizations centered on common issues. We're jetting back across the Atlantic to chat with an expert at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Until we meet again. This episode was produced by Daniel Henderson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu to learn more about our work.